I'm going to just start out by noting a few things I read kind of getting prepared for the talk, some questions that those sort of led to, and I'm noting that in part because those will be questions that I'm hoping to maybe try to shed some light on by the end of the talk. So one thing I was taking a look at this summer was actually a paper from Martin on the different ways that we might fail vis-a-vis the first part of the formula of humanity. So he has this very interesting paper about how, look, obviously the discussion of treating someone as a mere means gets a lot of focus in Kant, but there's a kind of plurality of ways we can screw up with regard to the first part of that formula, right? You can also, for instance, treat someone as a mere thing when you're indifferent to them. And one thing that I kind of liked about that, taking that sort of pluralistic approach to the first part of the formula of humanity, it just made me kind of wonder a little bit more about, well, can we be kind of similarly pluralistic with regard to the second half of the formula of humanity, right? Are there ways beside active beneficence, which is, of course, the thing we're mainly pointed to in the groundwork, other ways that we might positively affirm others as ends in themselves? So that was one thing going on. I'd also looked at these really interesting pieces from Paulina and Melissa on consent in relation to the formula of humanity. And of course, Paulina's work has a really, really interesting emphasis on actual consent in relation to the formula of humanity. And so this will obviously be taking people down the road further than just like strict Kant exegesis would. But ultimately, it seems like we might want to, if we're doing the Kantian project, say more about how and when consent is implicated, say especially more about actual consent and what that consists of, and how that's involved in both not treating someone as a mere means, but also allowing for the further possibility of positively affirming someone's humanity. And then just the third thing that was kind of hovering around getting sort of ready for this conference, obviously with the Metaphysics of Morals being written so long after the groundwork, just wanted to get more of a sense for myself of whether or not that text seems as though it aligns neatly with the presentation of the formula of humanity in the groundwork, or do we have a sense that there's something, different or unusual going on there? So the overall thing I'm going to try to argue for today, I'm going to argue that in the Metaphysics of Morals, Kant develops a more expansive and pluralistic account of the ways that we can engage that second part of the formula of humanity, so a more expansive and pluralistic account of how it is we might positively affirm or agree with another's humanity. And I'm going to argue that he does this in a kind of twofold fashion. On the one hand, by developing some limited skepticism about benevolence, and then on the other hand, by trying to elevate alternatives to active benevolence. And to establish that, I'm going to be looking at three things: some general features of Kant's account of duties to others, also Kant's account of friendship, but then especially, and then this is where I'll spend the majority of my time, looking at Kant's discussion of cosmopolitanism and the implications that seems to have for the formula of humanity. And that'll be kind of the main focus today, or where there's much more likely to be something interesting happening. And just to note as well, a couple of assumptions sort of hovering in the background. One is I'm just going to assume everyone's familiar with the formula of humanity as it's presented in the groundwork, so I won't spend any time going over that. And then two, I'm a little more apprehensive here, but you all will tell me if this ends up being a problem. Like probably a whole bunch of sort of like somewhat similar Kantian locutions will come out of my mouth in a roughly interchangeable way, where I'll be talking about, for instance, like regarding humanity as an end in itself versus a person as an end in themselves. And I'm hoping that that kind of looseness doesn't cause a problem. But again, that is something people will let me know as we go. Okay, so moving on to the first chunk of this then, still on the first page of the handout, some really quick things to say about Kant on duties of love in the Metaphysics of Morals. There are three of those: beneficence, gratitude, and sympathy. So just some sort of like ready at hand observations. Of those three duties of love, it is, to me at least, kind of striking how the latter two, gratitude and sympathy, they're noteworthy for how much they involve a kind of attitudinal component, as opposed to any sort of specific guidance on external action. And yes, of course, you do need to engage in external actions in order to like express gratitude or reveal your sympathy for another person. But in those cases, the external actions are important really just for how they're like a kind of medium or a conveyor of the attitude. They're not kind of materially significant in their own right. And it's also interesting, related on that front, when Kant talks about beneficence in the Metaphysics of Morals, he emphasizes how heartfelt benevolence, which doesn't necessarily involve any physical results, also deserves to be called a duty of virtue. So collectively, you're getting this kind of interesting emphasis on attitudes in a way that you just didn't really get strongly communicated in the groundwork. And then one more little point about his discussion there. When he does finally talk about beneficence, he appeals explicitly to the formula of universal law. And that's interesting for a couple of reasons, right? Like, one thing is that he doesn't very often give any explicit justifications of any of those duties in the doctrine of virtue. They're just kind of there. So it's unusual to see him having such an explicit justification attached to any of these duties. And then when we do get this explicit justification, that it's in terms of universal law, right? He doesn't seem to reference the formula of humanity, even though you would think he would reference exactly that. Instead, the discussion is a lot about how taking self-interest and making sure that it kind of can transform into a common or general interest. So that's a kind of interesting feature too, the way that there's a kind of a weakening of the link between beneficence and the formula of humanity. And so together, all of that does seem to give a little bit the sense that beneficence might not express recognition of another's humanity as directly in the Metaphysics of Morals as it did in the groundwork. So just a little bit of a kind of thread that we'll sort of pull on there. Okay, moving on to the second part, right? This is about what Kant has to say about friendship and the implications of that discussion for beneficence. So Kant has a very complex message about beneficence and friendships. He does emphasize that friends, of course, have to be ready to help each other in times of need. But he also thinks that those sort of situations are pretty rare and not all that characteristic of what friends do. He says, by alternative, the things that are really characteristic of friendship are things like sharing ideas and opinions. He also talks about, in the lectures on ethics, being able to rejoice in the merits and successes of others. He, now moving on to the second page of the handout, also gives some arguments, even if they're brief, about why he's sort of looking beyond beneficence in friendships. So he talks about, for instance, the likelihood that we'll overstep the bounds of respect with another person, right? Go too far and end up making them feel small. He references also how there's likely going to be inequality between the different parties, and this will lead to certain distortions, right? The more well-to-do person will end up kind of smuggling in their own ends more into the friendship. And so what looked like helping another actually is just an expression of what one oneself values. And then kind of broadening this out, I want to try to argue, and I think this should be like a pretty easy case to make, that these worries about overstepping the bounds of respect and inequality that seem to explain why Kant is a bit skeptical about beneficence in friendships probably apply more generally, right? So when, for instance, we are dealing with people we don't know well, those we're not intimate with, we're very likely to overstep the bounds of respect. When, again, we're dealing with people who are not especially close to or strangers, those concerns about inequality seem as much to apply again here as well. And also, if we're thinking about beyond the realm of friendship, these alternative modes of engagement that Kant mentions, it seems like these can be practiced more widely. So, for instance, you can share your opinions with people you don't know very well, even if you have to be careful in that. You can express admiration for the successes and merits of strangers. He also talks about, of course, how you can be a friend of human beings, where you just take joy in the well-being of all others, regardless of who they are. And then the last little bit of this argument, it seems to me pretty straightforward, but again, people will tell me if I'm wrong, that these alternative ways of engaging others that you can use in both friendship and more generally should be thought of ways of affirming the humanity in them. So when you take joy in another's merits, you're, of course, attesting to their status as a practically rational agent and their agency. when you share opinions, especially if that revolves around moral character, you're of course then engaging another's morally practical reason. Even in cases where you're sharing opinions about more theoretical matters, you're engaged in something like inquiry, right? A dynamic pursuit about what you take to be collectively worthwhile and important to like consider in your lives. And all of this then, for me, would just suggest that we take a very broad understanding of what another's humanity consists in, and that we look for there to be similarly diverse and broad ways of engaging or affirming another's humanity. Okay, so moving on to then what's supposed to be the kind of largest, bulkiest part of the paper. What I want to try to do next is talk about Kant's characterization of cosmopolitan right and the social relationship it seems like Kant is trying to protect and promote in establishing a right to visit and a right to be hospitably received. And I'm going to try to argue that this discussion has important implications for Kant's ethics. So first, I'll be arguing that in cosmopolitanism, Kant gives us a model for how to positively affirm the humanity in others that distances us quite far from active beneficence. And second, that this alternative model of interpersonal relationships will prompt us to reconsider certain features of the formula of humanity. It'll prompt us to reconsider the anti-paternalistic flavor of the formula of humanity, and it will also, I think, help us appreciate some nuances in how consent may relate to the respect for humanity and promotion for humanity that Kant is so interested in. Okay, one small preliminary, which I really can't get to here except to flag, and then of course people will tell me if this is a problem. It might seem a little bit odd to be looking to cosmopolitan right to say something about the formula of humanity, simply insofar as, right, cosmopolitan right belongs to the doctrine of right. We generally associate the formula of humanity with Kant's ethics. And so if you have a preoccupation about there being a kind of very strict division between right and morality in Kant, it might seem funny or somehow suspect to look to the doctrine of right, look to something happening in it in order to shed light on the formula of humanity. And I can't get into this worry at any length here. I'm hoping it'll just suffice to say, and I've got a few little pieces of evidence. Seems to me like the formula of humanity makes a lot of appearances throughout Kant's practical philosophy. Seems like it lives, quite a life in the doctrine of right as well as in the doctrine of virtue. And just given that, I'm going to kind of work with the assumption that to understand the formula of humanity, it is fitting to kind of toggle back and forth between right and ethics in Kant, look at how it makes appearances in both, and sort of use that kind of shared presence of the formula of humanity across both texts in order to get some further conceptual clarity. So that's just a kind of assumption happening in the background. Again, people will tell me if it's a problem. But with that in place, what I'm going to do now is make what I'll describe as like kind of two passes through the metaphysics of morals and the discussion of cosmopolitan right. In the first pass, I'm going to just lay out what seems to be like most readily the case or the most sort of obvious set of conclusions you would draw about the formula of humanity based on cosmopolitan right. And then in the second pass, I'll try to revisit the discussion of cosmopolitan right, find some more nuance there, and build out some extra layers of detail that I think will be really interesting. Okay, but then going to the first pass through, this is the top of the third page of the handout. I think as a kind of first pass, I think it's pretty easy to establish that the cosmopolitan right to visit, that you can make the case that it directly instantiates some of the core commitments Kant expresses in the groundwork regarding how to treat humanity as an end in itself. So I'll just say a little bit more here. This right to visit and to be hospitably received that Kant discusses, that is in turn described a bit more in terms of a right to engage in commerce or Verkehr. And he talks about you doing this both citizens of one place visiting citizens of another. He talks also about nation states or their representatives making contact with other nation states on other sides of the earth. And to give just also a quick example of like commerce, right? Let's say I have an abundance of some product and I want to be able to sell it. I hear about someone in some other corner of the globe who might have a need for it, and so I'll want to visit and get a kind of interaction or exchange going, hopefully one that will be mutually beneficial to both of us, right? So that's a kind of example of these commercial relationships. And just to play with that a little bit more too, it's nice to appreciate the way that these relationships don't fit neatly in just right or ethics, but share features of both. So on the one hand, these cosmopolitan relationships, they belong in the doctrine of right. He describes cosmopolitanism in terms of a right, and he obviously thinks you need institutions and rules and a kind of juridical order in order to make these relationships possible and in order to get them off the ground. But on the other hand, he also does not believe that any of these institutions that help like codify this right to visit, he does not think that any of them have coercive power. It's very clearly going to be up to other individuals and nation states to recognize these rights to visit. And so in that way, the right to visit has some features that are a little bit more similar with regard to ethics, because there has to be this sort of free uptake or recognition of these demands. I think we could also say that commerce seems to, in a really nice, interesting way, embody the language of the formula of the kingdom of ends, which enjoins us to rightfully relate to one another as ends and means. So obviously in the groundwork, we get the formula of humanity, first this stipulation against mere means use, then this claim that there's also a need to promote and to positively agree with humanity. Then in the formula of the kingdom of ends, Kant kind of builds on all of that, right? Talks about how there needs to be these systematic relations where you and I can act as means to each other's ends. And commerce seems to do this really nicely, right? So if I have some product and you decide you want to purchase it, what's happening there is you're getting further along in your own ends, right? Presumably my product facilitates that, right? So I'm able to be a means to you. But insofar as you purchased it from me, you're helping me enrich myself and have a variety of more means to my own ends. So it has that nice kind of like reciprocal means-ends use there. And so just to kind of wrap that up, because of the way that cosmopolitan right enables commerce, I think we could say that this right functions as a kind of political or quasi-juridical analog to the second and third formulas in the groundwork. That formal relationship between means and ends that Kant describes in those two formulas, it gets transposed onto his characterization of commercial relations as they're established in a right to visit. Okay, so making a second pass through all that now, again, nothing I want to really refute there. I want to more just kind of add to it and build on it. I'm going to try to argue next that this discussion of cosmopolitan right includes an additional and an interestingly different model of social relations, one that will offer a distinctive set of insights and proposals regarding how to treat another as an end. So I'll start to try to build that out. As a first element of it, I'm going to have to lean very heavily into how Kant says that these rights to visit are grounded in persons and societies standing originally in a community or a Gemeinschaft of land. So people will know if this seems like it's reading too much into it, but to really kind of push on that claim, that's going to kind of be what I have to do here. So Kant adds to this initial point that this original community is characterized by a Wechselwirkung, or interaction, possible physical interaction, or Kommercium taking place among its members. And the bundling of these terms together, Gemeinschaft, Wechselwirkung, Kommercium, it seems really significant. So just to play with that a little. The notion of Wechselwirkung, very rarely used by Kant. It comes up a couple of times in the Metaphysics of Morals when Kant is describing cosmopolitanism. But all the other references are actually from Kant's theoretical philosophy, particularly the third moment of the category of relation, which is community or Gemeinschaft, and then in the third analogy, where he's spelling out further how those relational categories structure spatiotemporal experience. He talks about spatiotemporal things existing in a community, again, Gemeinschaft, where there's reciprocal causality of substances with regard to their accidents. Kant then starts the third analogy proper with the principle that all substances, insofar as they can be perceived in space as simultaneous, are in thoroughgoing interaction. And just to explain a little bit more this notion of interaction or Wechselwirkung, let me say how I understood it at first and how that ended up being wrong, because that contrast can actually, I think, be helpful. So I had imagined that he had in mind something like how, given the way that nature is arranged, like one object might be able to be an agent or patient of another just depending on circumstances. So to give an example, like usually I'm the sort of agent and the chair is the patient, like I weigh more than the chair, so I can like sit on it and make it do all the things I want it to do. But of course, in other cases, like if it's really windy outside and it's an outdoor chair, the chair might be blown around and knock me over and sort of be in the agent role where I'm in the patient role there. That's what I kind of initially thought was going on with this notion of like a community of substances in interaction. And it turns out that is wrong. And Kant actually gives a different example to describe this distinctive relationship of community and the distinctive relational category it's meant to capture. And the example he gives comes from the metaphysical foundations of natural science. And it's the example of a coiled spring. And Eric Watkins and Michaela Massimi have really helpful stuff on this, so very indebted to them on this. But think about how a spring works, right? When a spring encounters some other object, you would not say that the spring is just getting passively acted on, right? What's instead happening is that when that object hits the spring, the tension in the spring exerts pressure back on that object in one interaction, right? There's a kind of simultaneity of forces there. There's this kind of push-pull and this kind of deep reciprocity that you get in the example of the spring. That there's that kind of interesting mutuality of forces there seems to be even further reinforced by Kant when he uses this notion of commercium to describe what's at stake here. That's also not a term he uses often. It really comes up in two contexts. One, in any of those passages from like the first critique where he's talking about community and interaction in the way just described, commercium is referenced there. But then the other place where he talks about commercium is actually in his discussion of rights of persons akin to rights of things. And the prime example he gives is how marriages are a sexual commercium. And it's interesting because what he seems to have in mind there, right? Obviously with it being Kant, you think about his commentary on women being one that puts them in these very passive roles. But he seems to recognize that in the marital union, what's actually happening there is that there's a kind of true reciprocity of forces where each is exerting a kind of profound power on the other, right? And so women and wives are expected to be issuing pressure or resistance back as opposed to just receiving that pressure. And all of that then seems to dovetail with something that Sankar Muthu suggests, which is that commerce and commercium is not really or principally about market exchange or trade. It's much broader, right? It can include exchange relationships where there's like goods and services,